Cooldown rate. What is it? How does it work? What are the hidden mechanics behind cooldown rate? This video will explain the most basic concepts of cooldown rate, all the way up to the most intricate mechanics so you can play to your peak potential. To start, we have to understand a few key things. Firstly is that every god in the game has abilities, and each of these abilities has a set cooldown. That is the amount of time between casting an ability and being able to use that ability again. So if we look at Sol for example, we can see her second ability has a cooldown of 10 seconds. If we look at Ymir, we can see his second ability has a cooldown of 8 seconds at rank 1, which decreases to 6 seconds at rank 5. When you buy items with cooldown rate on them, like Breastplate of Valor, it will decrease the cooldown of all of your god's abilities, so you spend less time waiting between each cast of the same ability. But just how much will it decrease your cooldowns by? Well, to figure that out, we have to look into the equation that defines how much cooldown rate affects cooldowns, which looks like this. It seems a bit scary, but all you have to take away from this is that the more cooldown rate you get, the less effective it becomes. That is to say, the more and more you get, the less and less it will decrease the time between being able to fire the same ability twice. Let's take a quick example to make sure you understand. So if Sol has a base 10-second cooldown on her second ability, and then she buys 10 cooldown rate, the new cooldown of that ability goes to 9.1 seconds, which is a reduction in cooldown of 0.9 seconds. Now we take Sol's second ability with 20 cooldown rate, we get that her second ability will go to a cooldown of 8.3 seconds, which is a reduction of 0.8 seconds compared to when she had just 10 cooldown rate. This just shows that the first 10 cooldown rate reduced the cooldown of the ability more than the second 10 cooldown rate. This effect of something returning less the more you invest is called diminishing returns. Now we have that example out of the way, we can generalise this idea and apply it to every god in the game by looking at how cooldown rate affects gods' cooldowns by a percentage of the god's original cooldown. So this will be the same for every god regardless of their original cooldown. Here is a graph that shows what percentage cooldown each amount of cooldown rate gives you. Cooldown rate is shown on the bottom axis, while percentage cooldown is shown on the y-axis. At 0 cooldown rate, which is shown here on the bottom axis, we can see the god's cooldown is at 100%. So from our example earlier, with 0 cooldown rate, Sol's second ability has a cooldown of 10 seconds, which is 0% cooldown. Now, if we move to 10 cooldown rate, we can see that will give the god 9.09% cooldown, so Sol's second ability will go from 10 seconds to 9.09 seconds. Or, if we take a god that had an ultimate ability that had a 100 second cooldown, it will now have a cooldown of 90.9 seconds. We can keep moving over the graph for different levels of cooldown, so 25 cooldown rate gives us 20% cooldown, so in the example of Sol, it would give us a cooldown from 10 seconds to 8 seconds. 50 cooldown rate gives us 33.33% cooldown, and 100 cooldown rate gives us 50% cooldown, which means you could fire abilities twice as fast when compared to when you had 0 cooldown rate. You can tell straight away that cooldown rate suffers from diminishing returns because this graph isn't a straight line. It gets less and less steep the further right along the graph we go. But let's dive into the numbers so you know exactly how much value you are getting out of cooldown rate. Here we can see that from 0 to 20 cooldown rate provides you with 16.67% cooldown, but from 20 to 40 cooldown rate provides you with only an additional 11.67%. From 40 to 60 cooldown rate only provides you with an additional 8.93% cooldown. 60 to 80 provides you with an additional 6.94% cooldown, and 80 to 100 cooldown rate provides you with just 5.56% extra cooldown. So from 0 to 20 cooldown rate is 3 times more efficient than 80 to 100 cooldown rate. This is really something to bear in mind when choosing your build, because item slots are so valuable, and because how you spend your gold is also so important. You have to think if it's really worth investing so much into a stat that only gets worse the more you build of it. That's the ins and outs of how cooldown rate works, but there are a few more things that should be mentioned. There are a few items in the game that provide some kind of cooldown reduction outside of just cooldown rate. Let's start with Chronos pendant and its passive. Chronos pendant provides you with a 1 second reduction to all of your cooldowns every 10 seconds. The mechanics of this can be thought of as a 10% reduction to all of your cooldowns. This graph is the same as the graph I've just showed you, but the red line is showing the percentage cooldown of a god with Chronos pendant. We can see the lines are identical apart from the red line is just 10 units lower than the blue line. What I'm trying to show you is that Chronos pendant's passive is not affected by any diminishing returns, no matter how much cooldown rate you already have. So it's a really good option for boosting your total cooldown without being affected by how much cooldown rate you already have. The second item with a similar effect is Joutun's Revenge, which provides you with a flat reduction of 2 seconds to all of your non-ultimate cooldowns and a 6-second reduction to your ultimate cooldown. This flat reduction again isn't affected by how much cooldown rate you already have, and so is another good option if you want to stack lots of cooldown reduction, even though the passive is quite difficult to proc and is highly inconsistent. The third item that affects cooldown is the World Stone, which provides you with a 20% reduction to your ultimate cooldown. But there is a very noteworthy mechanic of this item. The amount of cooldown this item provides does depend on how much cooldown rate you already have, and so is affected by diminishing returns. The 20% cooldown it provides is dependent on your ultimate ability's current cooldown, with cooldown rate. So let me give you an example. Let's take a god with an ultimate ability with a 100-second cooldown, with 0 cooldown rate and World Stone. Then their ultimate ability would have a cooldown of 80 seconds. Now, if we give that god 25 cooldown rate and they don't have World Stone, their ultimate cooldown will again be reduced to 80 seconds. Now, if they have both World Stone and 25 cooldown rate, their ultimate ability would now have a cooldown of 64 seconds, not 60 seconds. So with no cooldown rate, World Stone reduced their ultimate cooldown by 20 seconds. With 25 cooldown rate and World Stone, it reduced their ultimate cooldown by just 16 seconds. So we can see the diminishing returns of cooldown rate affects just how efficient World Stone is. We can see this again by plotting a graph. The blue line shows how cooldown rate affects percentage cooldown, just like in the first graph I showed you. But now the orange line is showing how the World Stone also affects your overall percentage cooldown. So at 0 cooldown rate, we can see the World Stone provides you with 20% cooldown. Remember, this is compared to the base cooldown of the ability. So this is 20% cooldown greater than the cooldown of the ability when you have no cooldown rate. But when we do start introducing cooldown rate into the mix, we can see the cooldown difference begins to decrease, meaning the more cooldown rate you have, the less efficient World Stone passive becomes, because these two mechanics work against each other. It's worth noting that the orange line is always below the blue line, which means World Stone will always be providing some cooldown to your ultimate ability. It just becomes less efficient the more cooldown rate you have. And that's everything. I really hope you enjoyed this video and learned just how cooldown works. If you have any questions, please leave a comment, and remember, don't guess, do the math.